Well, welcome to the Institute for Government, everyone. My name is Hannah White, and I'm the director here, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you all here. Those of you who are here in the room and the over 2,500 people who are joining us online. Thank you for joining us for our annual conference, Government 2025, which we're really pleased to be holding in partnership with Grant Thornton. A lot has changed since we last held this conference a year ago. Many of the key people in UK government have changed. We have the first new Labour government in 14 years, a new leader of the opposition, a House of Commons in which over half of new MPs are new. The Liberal Democrats are resurgent, and a plurality of minor parties have greater voice. We have a new Cabinet Secretary. We have a new EU Commission and a new, albeit somewhat familiar, US President. Political narratives have also changed dramatically. This time in 2024, both the Labour and Conservative parties were telling us that they could fix the problems of the UK, including low growth, long-term underinvestment in public services, and significant public debt, without reducing either the scope of the state or increasing taxes. At the time, I said that was magical thinking, and now the magic has gone. In office, Labour misses no opportunity to emphasise its terrible fiscal inheritance and the resultant need for tax rises. Kemi Badenoch has arrived with a blank policy slate and apologies for the mistakes of previous Conservative administrations. I think that 2025 is going to be a make or break year for this government. In 12 months' time, Labour will be halfway through its usable term of office, before campaigning for the next general election begins to absorb all of its political bandwidth. Right now, we're 6 months in, and we've seen much to welcome from the new Labour administration. Most fundamentally, we've seen a step away from the political instability of recent years, which means the government has had more time to think and more energy to think about how to govern well. This is the question that we at the Institute for Government will continue to devote our energies to, and the one on which the government must maintain its focus. This is not just because of the difficult fiscal situation, it's also because the public is losing faith in the ability of government to improve their lives. New IFG polling that Joe Twyman from Deltapoll will be taking us through in the opening session shows that public expectations of what government can deliver are incredibly low. That means that ministers not only have a democratic imperative to stave off populism by showing the government can make people's lives better, they also have a political opportunity to bank a poll boost by governing effectively and outperforming public expectations. But to do so, ministers will need to make progress in 3 significant areas. First, they need to improve the government's ability to act strategically. The economic headwinds and Twitter or X storms that blew in the new year have illustrated once again just how difficult it can be for governments to stick to their course when external events and individuals intervene. As we've just heard, those of you who were here for the breakfast panel, the return of Donald Trump to the White House makes both more likely. Starmer and Reeves have both said that they will not be knocked off course, but our Centre Commission, which reported early last year, found that without significant reforms to Number 10, the Cabinet Office and the Treasury, no Prime Minister will have the support they need to operate strategically. We're pleased that Starmer has adopted some of our recommendations, but there is much more to do, especially around the spending review now underway in Whitehall and due to report in June. For Starmer, aligning the spending review process with his missions and milestones is essential if he wants to ensure that his government maintains focus on his key priorities. Second, ministers must be prepared to make tough choices. The government has made a virtue of listening, and that is a good thing, launching 17 policy reviews since July last year. But leadership is also about knowing when to stop listening and being able to take tough decisions that will please some and disappoint others. 2025 will be the year in which ministers must make those difficult decisions on where to site new towns, whether and when to increase defence spending, and how to redraw sentencing guidelines and the national curriculum. Achieving this will be less about listening to others and more about involving them in delivering change. From school readiness to net zero, partnership with industry and civil society will need to be a crucial part of the mix. This is something the Institute will be looking at this year, alongside new projects, looking at options for reform on some of the key challenges facing the government. And third, ministers must make serious progress with their project of rewiring the state. We agree with the Prime Minister's emphasis on the importance of this task, and our Whitehall Monitor report, which was published last week, shows just how much there is to do in the civil service. Progress on civil service reform has been limited in recent years, and accountability remains weak. If ministers are frustrated by slow progress, they should adopt the Centre Commission's recommendation of putting the civil service and an empowered civil service board on a statutory footing. That would enable them to hold the leadership of the civil service accountable for delivering against their reform priorities. The Institute will continue to press its recommendations in this space, as well as doing new research into the relationship between the effectiveness of the civil service and the ability of government to achieve its objectives. Now, a week may be a long time in politics, but a year at this point in the parliamentary cycle will pass in a flash. And yet 2025 is the year that will make or break the new government's chances of delivering on its promises ahead of the next election. A year is enough time for the government to do what is needed to build government's ability to be strategic, to make a series of tough policy choices, and to make serious progress towards rewiring the state. These are changes which have been long argued for by the IFG, and they would make a real difference to what government can achieve. Thank you. Now, before I hand over to Phil Woolley from Grant Thornton to say a few words, I just have to say a few logistical things for those of you joining us online and those of you who are here with us in the room. When we get to question time on any of our panels, any of our speeches, we will have people in the room with mics, and we will be passing those around. If you are asking a question, it's great if you could tell us who you are and where you're from, so we can understand that. There's an adjoining room. If anyone in the adjoining room has a question when we come to it, please do come and stick your head around the door so we can see you. And if you're online, we've got the normal Slido link, and the hashtag is Government 2025. So you can ask a question there. Also, people in the room can ask via Slido if you're feeling shy. But please do, as I say, tell us your name and organisation if you can. Okay, I would now really very pleased to welcome Phil Woolley from Grant Thornton, partner and head of public sector consulting, to say a few words.
Thanks, Hannah. Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you to the 2025 IFG Annual Conference. Grant Thornton is very happy to be sponsors for a third year. We support this conference because it starts the year with such a rich set of insights into the state of government and public services. And it's really interesting to cast our minds back to last year. I described how at Grant Thornton we were seeing challenges for our public sector clients that were really acute. Local authorities experiencing financial failure, NHS with acute workforce challenges and stalled investment programmes, to name just two. So it's going to be really fascinating, I think, this year with the agenda that we've got, to explore how the government is addressing these enormous problems under really tight fiscal constraints. So I'd encourage you all to engage fully in the breakouts this afternoon, etc., and really enjoy the day. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Phil. So we can go straight on to our first panel, which is titled 6 Months On, How is the Labour Government Performing? Hopefully, at that cue, people will burst through the door and come sit on the stage. Excellent.
go straight into it?
I'm going to do a bit of an intro first. Okay, hello everyone. I'm Emma Norris, I'm the Deputy Director at the Institute for Government. Thanks for joining us for our first full panel session. So it's just over 6 months since the general election that returned Labour to power for the first time in 14 years. Since then, quite a lot has happened. We've had a budget, we've had ministerial resignations, a new cabinet secretary, a number 10 reset, missions, milestones, international summits, and as our breakfast panel was discussing, a US election. Keir Starmer has faced quite a difficult inheritance, lots of tough choices, big decisions and bumps in the road. Many would say he has returned some stability after the post-Brexit years of never-ending political turmoil and drama. Now, the government has started to sketch out in a bit more detail what it is that it wants to achieve, what those missions mean in practice, and how it intends to reform the state to make a reality of that. So 6 months on, we're going to be talking about how we judge government's performance so far, and looking at the year ahead, what challenges await, and how government can make real progress in convincing the public that it is going to improve their lives. I've got a brilliant panel with me to discuss all those things. We've got Anushka Asthana, Deputy Political Editor of ITV News and author of Taken as Read, How Labour Won Big and the Tories Crashed the Party. Do buy it. Claire Ainsley is Director of the Project on Centre-Left Renewal at the Progressive Policy Institute, and she previously worked as the Executive Director of Policy to Keir Starmer in opposition. Sriskandarajah is the Chief Executive at the New Economics Foundation. He was previously the CEO of Oxfam GB and many years ago was a director at IPPR. And then we've got Joe Twyman, who's the co-founder and director of the pollsters Deltapoll. So we're going to start with some new polling that IFG commissioned that Joe is going to be presenting. It will tell us a bit about how the public is thinking and feeling about government. Then we'll have some discussion amongst the panel, and then we'll make sure that we have enough time for audience questions. If you're joining us online, then do start sending in your questions now. Okay, Joe, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you to the IFG for commissioning this poll. I'm going to be presenting just a snapshot of the results, and the full results are available for anyone to see on our web. For anyone to see all the way up there on our website. I want to start with the voting intention, the all-important headline finding. How is Labour doing in answer to this question? Well, not well, and I don't think that will come as a surprise to anyone in this room. The poll that we have published today shows very much a continuation of the trends that we and other pollsters have shown since the election itself, but particularly since the end of the summer. The Conservatives are broadly unchanged on where they were at the last election. Labour have fallen back. The Lib Dems broadly where they are, same with Green, but the big story is the rise of Reform, who have significantly increased their share since the election. And we're going to talk about part of why that might be and what the future might be for Labour. Because when thinking about polling, of course, it is only a snapshot of public opinion at the given time. And though the trends up to this point have been not good for Labour, it could be argued that over the last month or so they have stabilised. And longer term, we don't know where things might go. This, of course, takes place in the global context of a year last year where I believe every single election that took place, of more than 100 in democracies across the world and less democratic countries as well, of more than 100 elections, in each one, the incumbent government lost share of the vote. That is the first time that has ever happened in history. And in more than 8 out of 10 of those elections, the government lost on the left, on the right, etc., etc. This may be a continuation of that global trend. We shall see. So what is it that is underlying a lot of this data? Well, one of the things we looked at was the most important issue, most important problem facing you and your family, the most important problem facing the country. Two very different ways to look at the same question, but the overall answer remains the same. When you ask respondents what's the most important problem facing you and your family, top by some distance is the cost of living. A particularly difficult issue that we saw caused such issues for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in the United States, and has caused issues across the world. You can talk about controlling inflation, but in the perception of the public, that does not mean that your prices are coming down. It simply means they're not rising as much as they once were, and that is a problem for governments across the world. And when you ask about problems facing the country, you can see that, again, it's the same story. It has been said by some that immigration is the most important issue facing this country. Anyone who says that is trying to sell you something, usually a subscription to their Substack. What we have found is that immigration is significantly more important when asked about issues facing the country than when asked about issues facing families and individuals. It forms this sort of second tier, if you like, with the economy generally, but it's not close still to the cost of living. But when we break things down, and this is going to be quite difficult to see, but that big bar, that's reform supporters. So on the right-hand side, we've got Conservative, Labour, Lib Dem, Reform and others, for those of you for whom that's too small to see. I'm showing you this to illustrate two things. Firstly, this is what partisan division really looks like, and we'll refer back to this in later slides. But if you see 42%, more than 4 out of 10 Conservative supporters place immigration in their top 3 problems facing the country. Compare that to 7 in 10 Reform voters. And among Labour, fewer than 1 in 5, just 19%. Immigration is not as important an issue as it is for Reform voters. Now, that doesn't mean it's not important in absolute terms, but in relative terms, it's not as important. So what is it that's driving Reform's support? Well, it's immigration for a lot of their supporters, but more than that. It's about the trends for dissatisfaction, distrust and disapproval, not just of political parties and politicians, but of the political system generally, that we have seen now really for more than a decade. And Nigel Farage and co did not create that wave, but increasingly they're doing a good job of riding it in all the way to the shore. And looking beyond immigration, going back to the cost of living, of course, Labour has made it such a key pledge to talk about growth. But what do the public think about growth, and whether they believe that the Labour government will achieve growth by the time of the next election? You can see it's not great. Fewer than a quarter of all people believe that growth will be achieved by the time of the next election. Around 1 in 5 believes that it will be the same, but more than 4 in 10 believe the economy will have shrunk by the time of the next election, including 1 in 5 who think it will shrink a lot. It's worth pointing out that people are extraordinarily bad at explaining their own behaviour, and even worse at predicting where things will be. So instead, it's worth seeing this as a reflection of people's perceptions, their optimism or negativity, rather than their actual prediction for where levels of GDP will be at in 4 years' time. And to go back to the point about partisan divisions on the right of the graph, again, there are differences between the parties, but they're not enormous, not to the same degree as they are on, for instance, the importance of immigration. 35% of Labour voters believe that the economy is going to get bigger, but 27% think it's going to shrink. And overwhelmingly, a majority of Reform voters believe that it's going to shrink as well. But their figures are very similar to the Conservatives. And so, yes, Labour are more positive, but it's not the case that they're overwhelmingly positive. And that is an issue that Labour really has to address, given how important the cost of living is across the board, but particularly to its own voters. We gave respondents a choice, a classic choice on tax and spend. Inevitably, the issue is more complicated than this, but again, to get a sense of people's perceptions, we asked, would you like to keep taxes and spending on public services at the same level as now, that's yellow, increase taxes and spend more on public services, that's blue, and reduce taxes, that's red. A split right down the middle between keeping taxes as they are on 34% and increasing taxes on 34%. And again, not a huge amount of difference between the parties. The general consensus is one or the other. And in terms of reducing taxation, it's actually relatively small. Inevitably, as I say, there's more to it than that, but it's certainly worth pointing out that even among Reform UK supporters for whom the largest group support reducing taxes, it's still only 30%, which is fewer than the 36% who believe we should keep taxes as they are. And if cuts were to be made, I said to the IFG, if you run this question, you may find that the civil service comes top. And to their credit, they said, well, this is why organisations like the IFG are so important. And data like this represents an opportunity, highlighting the extreme feelings that people have. But seriously, when we provided a specific list of cuts, and yes, we could have changed the list that we provided, but given the lists that we provided, it was the civil service that came top. Climate change initiatives next, local government, welfare and benefits, NHS schools, pensions, not much support for that. And remember, this is people selecting in their top three. And so, again, a reflection of that dissatisfaction with the political process generally. And again, when you break that down, it's not the case that this is driven overwhelmingly by those on the right or Reform or the Conservatives, however you want to characterise it. The big difference actually is with baby boomers and compared to those who have just failed the fast track test in Gen Z. More than nearly two-thirds of baby boomers select the civil service in their top three, compared to under a quarter of Gen Z. But among party supporters, it's not the case that this is a particular bugbear for one group or another. And we also asked about how good governments were at doing government. Again, as an indication of this feeling of dissatisfaction, distrust, and disapproval. We provided a list of recent governments, and Liz Truss will no doubt be looking at that 1% and thinking, that is the foundation on which I can build. But it was Blair's Labour Party that comes top, followed by Johnson's Conservative. I think there's an element of recency bias, as geeks like me say. But for me, the most important finding is that even when the list is given, even when you have partisan differences, you still only have 1 in 5 people selecting Blair's government. You have a smaller number selecting Johnson's Conservatives, and yet nearly a third of people saying there is no real difference between any of them. The most popular option. And when we break that option down, again, the highest group is within Reform supporters, but they are not alone in that. And Labour, Lib Dem, Conservative, and particularly other parties, all have a significant minority within their ranks saying all of the governments in recent memory are all the same. From Blair to Truss, there's no difference. And I think as an indication of people's views of the political process, that is really important. And I think that plays in to the potential for Labour's fortunes over the next 4 years. Because if they are to deliver on growth, and if they are to deliver on other aspects, whether it's immigration or other issues, but particularly on things that are popular among Labour supporters, so the NHS, education, etc., if they are to be perceived as delivering on that, part of the challenge is to convince people that government can do good things and can be effective. The delivery challenge is a substantial one. And when helping with delivery, perhaps government should look to listen to more groups, should bring in greater numbers of different groups when making decisions. That was a question we asked, and this was the net score of the following groups who you believe government should generally be listening to more or less. Journalists. Sorry. Minus 40. Overwhelmingly a belief that they should be listened to less. That's not a rule for the Q&A though, is it? Women, older people, younger people, technology experts, though note not bosses of international tech companies, academics, public sector workers, campaign groups and charities, top business leaders. In all of those cases, there is an on balance belief that they should be listened to more, but it's really only journalists for which there's less. So does this provide the answer? Well, we shall see. I imagine that there is a difference between the potential to bring in more women, more older people and more young people in the reality, but nonetheless, I think it poses an interesting challenge for Labour in the years ahead. The full results are up on our website and the IFG website, and as I say, this is just a snapshot, so please do take a look at that. But for now, I'll hand back. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Joe. Anushka, I want to come to you first and ask, you've just heard the presentation, what stood out?
I shouldn't even be on the panel.
You're a woman.
I did want to ask you something. Was men on the list?
No, we just asked about women.
Okay.
Men was taken off the list.
Oh.
Simply for length, rather than anything else. But the good news is that for a very reasonable price, we'd be happy to run the question.
Do people think we should listen to men? That's the next one.
So what do you make of the polling, Anushka?
Well, I think that it's terrible for Labour, and they should be worried, and they are worried. And I just want to talk about some of the things that I think have gone wrong. I mean, the one thing I would say is their starting point was a fairly low percentage, 34%. And actually, one of the things I was doing when I was writing the book that you quite kindly mentioned was looking at the victory and how they achieved that victory, including how they achieved it on quite a low percentage, because it was extraordinarily efficient. And there isn't really much room to go from 34%. So if you're coming down from there, you are in a very difficult position, particularly if you can't get that same spread again. Now, I badly timed the final bit of my book, which was that I went to press in August 2024 and then came out a few months later, by which time things had gone quite badly wrong for the Labour government already. But I did end with a thought, which I still think is the big problem that they've got, which is we have a trust crisis in this country, unfortunately, including towards journalists and politicians, but people don't trust anyone. And that's why they say they think everyone's the same. And I think that a lot of the things that have gone wrong for Labour have fed into that narrative, that people feel they're not, they can't trust politicians. So winter fuel payments really made people very angry because they didn't know it was coming. Nobody had warned them, and it felt like a trust issue. Freebie gate. I mean, I remember standing on the edge of sports, like watching my kids play football. Very rarely do the parents on the edge of those football pitches talk about politics, but my God, did they talk about freebie gate. And the thing they said more than anything else was, they're all the same. And that was the problem that it fed into. I think the same with the budget. They'd said or implied that they wouldn't raise these massive taxes, and then they did exactly that. They would try and argue, well, it wasn't quite there in the manifesto, but it basically was. And so again, it is a trust issue. And I think that is the kind of biggest crisis that the government's facing, and that they need to try to rebuild, which is quite hard to do. I mean, just one mention in terms of reform, doing incredibly well. I mean, there are loads of Labour MPs who are completely terrified about reform a second in lots of places. And if the right can vote tactically and vote for reform in those seats and Tories in others, it's bad news for Labour in the same way the Labour and Lib Dem vote this time was very bad news for the Conservatives. That said, it's even worse news for the Conservative Party, arguably. And so if there's one bit of reassurance, it might be that this doesn't look good for the Tories either. That's my thoughts.
Thank you, Danny. I want to continue talking to you about the trust issue, but perhaps specifically on growth. Fewer than a third of the respondents thought that government's policies would grow the economy over the next 4 years. What can the Chancellor do to make growth happen? But I guess picking up on Joe's perception point, what can government do to convince people that their lives are going to feel different?
Yeah, good question, and maybe the sort of critical question that will determine the sort of next 4 years, and confirmed by your polling, Joe. Two things. I think one, I don't know if everyone can see it, but I love Grant Thornton's slogan there. Success tomorrow starts with making the right decisions today, which I quite like, and I think that should be Rachel Reeves's philosophy, and for two reasons. One is, in some ways, what she and the government need to do is wait, because they've announced a whole bunch of things in the government last year. They will do more in the spending review. All of that is going to take time before it feeds through into the sort of real or perceived benefits to the majority of people in the country. And in some ways, the sort of government or governance is about patience and not panicking and not doing anything without sort of thinking it through. So I think there is a sort of success tomorrow challenge, which I know is politically incredibly difficult to manage, particularly in the sort of current media and social media environment in which, governments are held to account minute by minute rather than, quarter by quarter, let alone years by year. And then the other thing is around making the right decisions today. And there I do worry a little bit about a government that seems like it's falling back into a very tired and I would argue broken understanding of how economic growth works, particularly in the 21st century. So take, for example, today we're hearing, and it's still we're hearing, there's no public announcement, that 3 airport runways are going to be approved by this government in Luton, Gatwick and Heathrow. Now, on the face of it, you might argue, well, that's going to be good for growth because there will be new building projects that will have better connectivity particularly into London. The problems associated with a decision or set of decisions like that are huge. My colleagues at NEF have a report out just today that shows that just on the extra emissions from the expanded airport capacity in those 3 airports, we will cancel out in 5 years' time the gains that we make through the Clean Power Plan. So all the effort the government is putting into making the great energy transition will be cancelled out in just 5 years through airport expansion. But more importantly, perhaps, and this is my point about the sort of outdated model of growth, you might have argued in the late 20th century that air travel is a good way of boosting economic growth, particularly because business leaders or host meetings in places like London, they fly back and forth. All of that, particularly since COVID, seems to have fundamentally changed, and so there's a sort of new economics of aviation that we're sort of missing out on. So I use as an example of the right choices. So, the government says, okay, we could expand aviation, or we could put that money into the Warm Homes Plan or retrofitting our homes, which would have similar economic impacts in terms of a sort of the Keynesian impact in terms of creating employment and those. But, and this comes back to your point about perception, would have far more real impacts on people's lives and livelihoods and, to Joe's point, the cost of living. And I suppose that to me is ultimately what this is about, because surely the lesson over the last few years, maybe a few decades, is that the sort of obsession with aggregate GDP growth is coming to sort of haunt us now, because it's what's costing governments that are delivering, overall growth, but in highly unequal societies where the sort of distribution of the benefits of that growth are very unfair and unequal, the vast majority of people don't feel the benefits of that. So for me, the right decisions have also got to be about the sort of the quality of that growth, to make sure that the sort of distributional impacts of what growth we do achieve are felt by those people who, as Joe has said, are sceptical about this government's ability to deliver growth for them.
Thank you, Danny. Claire, I want to just pick up on Danny's kind of success tomorrow problem, because one of the things that struck me when we looked at the polling was that the majority of respondents aren't just unconvinced that government's making a difference to their lives now. They're also, that's probably understandable, we're 6 months in, but they're also sceptical about whether they will feel a difference in 4 years' time. And Labour's whole message has been around delivering longer-term change, a set of missions, a decade of renewal. So I suppose kind of first, should the government be concerned that that doesn't appear to have landed yet? And then I guess the kind of bigger question is, how do they deal with that kind of delivery challenge?
Yeah, I think they should be concerned, and I agree with Anushka's take on it. I think for the criticisms, but also the fact that the government is like very, very alive to this sort of problem of promising a long-term change and not delivering benefits kind of overnight, and all of the kind of bumps in the road, diplomatically put, that we've all kind of experienced. So I think there is a problem on kind of long-term change, but I do think that is what is underpinning the government, is this prospect of long-term change. And I think if you look at just this morning, I don't know if people saw the PwC report in terms of Britain being put second in, out of 28 countries as the best prospect for investment. When you actually step back from some of the day-to-day decisions, I agree with Danny that actually some of the big decisions that Rachel Reeves has already made are going to be extremely consequential for the country, and therefore need to be seen in that kind of longer-term view. That doesn't tell you to voters why they should be validated for having voted Labour back in July, and the proof points they're looking for at the moment aren't necessarily good ones, the freebies, etc., etc. They're all the sorts of things that Labour said were going to be different. So I think they do have to stick to the long-term story, because I think it is part of how we're going to turn the country around. I think if you look at business confidence, it's actually performing much better than some of the headlines would suggest around the budget decisions on national insurance. But I think you have to have a much stronger story to voters and just push that all of the time. I think if you look at what's happened to the Democrats in the States, which is where a lot of my research now is on, actually Biden took a load of decisions which, we look at the US economy, and the performance of the US economy has been extraordinary compared to our own in terms of getting growth, putting that debate to one side at the moment. But it's not delivered the electoral benefits for the Democrats, and that is because people haven't felt it in their pockets. They've associated the high government spending with inflation, and we know that a lot of that has been created by global factors, but that hasn't been how voters have experienced it. So I think the big lessons for Labour is stick to your longer term plan. You're actually taking some of the big decisions, I think are the right decisions, but speak much more clearly to the struggles that voters are facing. And when they're sort of thinking that cost of living is their top number one issue, we could be talking about energy bills and what we're going to be doing on energy bills every single day. The things that, with Anushka accepted, that the kind of the lobby are chasing are not necessarily things that are stressing households out. So let's start talking about the things that they are facing, which is a lot of the fact that all of our costs are rising. I don't know if anyone's got their insurance bill emails, but for no good reason, my broadband bill's going up again, and why aren't we talking about those sorts of things? So I think a real, capture the sort of the anger people feel and channel it into standing up for the people over some of these institutions that are just ripping people off. And I'm afraid the state is up there with the institutions that people don't think are working for them.
And I want to talk about the state in a minute, but I just want to spend a moment on reform. And Jo, I'm interested to hear from you on this, and Claire, I'm going to come to you as well. We're hearing from the Conservatives and the Lib Dems later today, but reform are at least one of the major parties that Labour's going to be worrying about. How should Labour be handling the rise of reform, and what lessons can it take from elsewhere?
The major lesson that Labour and indeed the Conservatives can take comes from recent history, which is don't try and out-reform reform. Trying to out-UKIP didn't work very well. Trying to out-Brexit Party, the Brexit Party didn't work very well. And similarly, trying to out-reform won't work very well. The point about GDP, I think, is a really good one, because what GDP essentially is perceived by many, either consciously or subconsciously, is about the strength of the economy for the richest in society. And what reform are very good at doing is bringing it back to the price of eggs, to use an American example. And so you don't need to out-reform reform, but don't be afraid to fight it on its ground. And that doesn't mean trying to ape its argument, it means trying to tackle its argument and find emotional connections for instance, your policies around economic growth that don't just talk to GDP, your policies around immigration about control but with a focus on fairness. All of those types of things are what's needed, plus also exploiting the structural difficulties that reform has. It really struggled to get 650 candidates for the general election. There are, 18,000 local councillors? Finding 18,000 candidates is going to be even more difficult, and their strength in depth has yet to be tested. And so those are all points that I think are opportunities. But ultimately, Reform, and indeed all the other opposition parties, just need to sit there and say, I wouldn't do that. And if the public don't think things are going well, that's quite a good argument.
Mm-hmm. Claire?
Yeah, I mean, I think the slide that you had that stood out for me was the popularity of various governments and people's memory, although it's some time ago, that by far the most popular government was the kind of Labour government of 1997 onwards. And it made me think, what you can do with good growth. Like that was a growing economy, and it allowed the government of the time to then do actually quite big scale redistribution. I would, say the prescription now is something different, but growth, and I agree with Danny, you want it to be quality growth, but growth allows you to do things that we haven't been able to do in this country since the financial crisis of 2007 and 8. And I think the economic settlement is at the absolute core of why there is this just revolt of people, why people just feel things aren't working because they aren't working well for them. And at the core is people's costs and their kind of personal economy, if you like. So I think we actually have to be relentless in our pursuit of growth. We often say in this country we're putting growth first, and then we take decisions that actually aren't very good for growth. So I think some of the long-term planning is exactly right. But we also have to think about, and I think that's something for this audience in particular, is why do people feel like government's not working for them? Like, why is it that people feel they don't know how to hold to account for their poor healthcare? Like, people are totally baffled by who they're supposed to hold to account for those sorts of things. And I think it's really, really important that this message of insurgency is gripped by the centre as well, and not seeing it as an affront, but seeing how can we deliver services better for people? How can we meet their needs better? Because that is at the core of what is driving this kind of populist revolt. And unless we have a better answer to the problems people face, it will come for us too. It hasn't happened here yet. Brexit wasn't it. That was just a warning shot. It hasn't happened, and it could do unless we perform better.
Thanks, Claire. I said we were going to talk a little bit about the state. We saw from the polling results on where should cuts fall, civil service coming top. Rewiring the state is also part of how Labour plans to deliver change for the country. We agree that the state needs to be rewired here at IFG. We've written lots on what this could look like, from opening up the civil service to spreading power to reforming institutions at the centre of government, as we argued in our Centre Commission last year. I want to ask everybody on the panel, actually, one, how important do you think changes to the state itself are for the government to deliver? And if you do agree they're important, what should they look like? Danny, I'm going to put you on the spot and come to you first.
Sure. So I have a book out as well called Power to the People. It's out in July last year, and its fundamental analysis is that our understanding, so it's not about the state necessarily, but it's the democratic institutions that give legitimacy, we hope, to the state. And my fundamental argument is we've are sort of sleepwalking into a crisis of democracy, assuming that the way the sort of political institutions of today work are going to be good enough to sort of retain the trust of the vast majority of people. They're not. 7% of British people think that our politicians are acting in the national interest. That's the lowest it's been for decades and decades, and it keeps falling. At what point do we think that this model of representative democracy, with a first-past-the-post system, with parties that people think don't really differ from each other, at what point do we think we need to modernise? At what point do we think that the House of Lords need to be fundamentally reformed to make it a far more democratic, or a democratic institution? So I think that before we get to the mechanics of the state, I think the democratic institutions that buttress the state as we know it need a sort of modernisation, a 21st century makeover that's much more participatory, I would argue. Replace the House of Lords with the House of the People, make it select citizens by sortition. And I know at least there's one member of the House of Lords here. It's not about the current functions of the Lords, but it's about thinking about what might be a sort of much more participatory mechanism by which we bring people more effectively into decision-making through something like that. A permanent citizens' assembly as the upper house.
Thank you. Anushka?
I mean, it doesn't surprise me that the civil service is so far ahead, because if you ask somebody what do you want to take money out of? The thing that they least understand and least has a direct effect on their life, or the NHS? They're obviously going to choose the civil service. Just a side note on that, the climate stuff was second, and I think that's going to be a massive tension point for this government, because it is the second biggest thing that Reform talk about after immigration. And, you know, I think that there will be some tensions between number 10, I imagine, and Ed Miliband. And, you know, the point you've made, Danny, about aviation is a perfect example of where we're going to see that. That's going to be a kind of growth, climate and cost of living kind of issue conflating together. I mean, this is sort of more, I'd just say, what I'm hearing from people in government about the civil service. I mean, it is interesting. They came in, and do you remember all the ministers, they walked down the corridors and the civil service servants were cheering them, and they were like, we're going to be so nice to the civil service, and the civil service is going to love us. And my God, are they frustrated with the civil service from the Prime Minister down. I've never heard anything like it. I mean, this is obviously all out there, but I was at an event, that Spectator dinner, where about 6 people said to me they missed Dominic Cummings. And, I mean, Labour people, obviously. And so the frustrations are massive. And there are some people who say they were in the civil service in the Blair years, and they felt that it did operate very different to how it's operating now. I don't know how true that is or not, but there is a feeling that the Prime Minister himself is deeply frustrated that he can't get things done. And at the moment, he seems to think that it's the leavers in the civil service. And just next door in the Treasury, like, the frustration with the Office for Budget Responsibility is also quite funny, given how much they held the OBR up beforehand. Now they're just deeply frustrated because all the things they think are going to deliver growth, the OBR doesn't believe them. And, you know, you can have an argument about whether the OBR is right or not, but I can see this being a massive tension point for the government.
Thank you, Claire.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both of those remarks. I think you have to think, like, all of that sort of, like, input level frustration is there, but we have to think about what's the experience for people on the ground. And, like, if you think about, like, I don't want to use loads of anecdotal experiences, but we can probably all think of people who have been totally let down by their state services, who are being shoved from pillar to post. If you are exposed to using state services a lot, like, you are being totally let down, and it's really, really costly, and it's really, really inefficient. So I agree with those issues, but I think we have to talk much more in terms of people's experience and work backwards from there and work on fixing those problems. So the very local, personalised experience of services. Like, I understand why that speech was made about the civil service, but on the whole, people are like, get on with it. Like, get on with it. This is my urgency. And the thing that's been going through my head, like, as we've seen, like, all of the debate about the kind of the child sex abuse, the postmaster scandal, all of these long-term inquiries, and people just must think, what are we doing? Like, what is the state doing that it's taking years and years and years of injustices, 20, 30 years? And I think we have to ask that question for, you know, I'm not saying we have responsibility personally here, but, like, if you're a member of the public, you're just thinking, my taxes are going up, the state can't sort out these big issues, and meanwhile, my friend's been to A&E 5 times because nobody can get her a social worker because apparently they don't exist for her threshold anymore. Like, you are just deeply frustrated. So, yeah, I get why people in government are frustrated, but also hear it how the public hear it. They don't want to hear about that. They want to hear about how you're going to fix things on the ground. So there are lots of policy answers we can talk about what might be the solution to those things, like localised devolution, transparency, putting technology in. There's a whole bunch of answers around that. But really understand what is the problem you're trying to solve. And, like, with the greatest respect, my former boss, I'm not worried about how the Prime Minister is frustrated. I'm worried about this person over here and how she is experiencing social care right now.
Brilliant. Thank you, Claire. Jo, if it's all right, I'm going to have to go to audience questions at this point. Sorry. But I will direct one of those questions to you. I'm going to take questions from the audience in groups of 3. Can you please say who you are, where you're from? We're going to have to finish in just over 5 minutes because we then have a Singapore link to set up. So if I can ask you to be relatively brief in the way you ask questions. So who would like to ask the panel something? Got one here? Oh, Tim, sorry, Tim, just wait for the mic. And if you can just say who you are.
Tim Loyney, Chief Economist at Nesta. If number 10 asked you what's the one thing you would do to increase economic growth that doesn't cost anything, what would it be?
Thank you. I'm going to try and take them in groups of 3. So does anybody else want to ask something? There you go.
Thank you. I'm Andrew Haldenby from the Effective Governance Forum, which campaigns for better management in government. Thank you for a brilliant panel and what a way to start the conference. Haven't we seen a kind of object lesson in how not to do it? Right? If we wanted a government, we would want the political side to tell the truth and respond to the issues that voters need to be sorted out. And perhaps as Anushka said, promises were made in opposition that were not carried through in government, tax being the most obvious, so that's been broken. And then on the machinery of government side, I think the panel is probably being a bit generous. In health, there's clearly a reform agenda, and I believe that will make a difference. I think it's hard to see another one in any other part of government I know there's stuff happening, but it's kind of business as usual. You would expect other governments, even the Sunak government, to do a lot of that similar stuff. So, isn't the last 6 months a sort of mirror? And if we put all that in a mirror, can we not see what an ideal government would look like?
Thank you. Okay, Joe, is there one final question at the back? Yep.
Grace from the Future Governance Forum. I was really interested in the polling around how people in the government to listen to women and others much more. And I wondered what the panel's thoughts are on how I feel like that raises a tension between, we want the government to lead with more purpose, but also we want the government to collaborate more, a more kind of collective version of leadership and governance across civil society and across business, for instance. And I just wondered whether that raises a tension at this particular moment for the current government.
Brilliant, thank you. Joe, I'm going to come to you first, and I wonder if you could particularly focus on Andrew's question on, is this, a lesson in how not to do it?
It's a really good point. The last 10 years really have been at various points textbook examples of how not to do things. And what I think a lot of them have in common is they forget the fact that the average person in the street and the 50% of people less engaged than the average person in the street isn't actually paying attention to specific policies and announcements and things like that. Instead, it's about broad narratives, the stories that we tell ourselves and each other. And this country faces enormous questions and problems around things like the ageing population, climate change, globalization, rise of China, take your pick. All of those are issues that successive governments have not really tackled at all. And so there is a need to focus on the idea that you need to deliver on that. You need to deliver on that and other things, but in ways that people perceive are being effective through broad narratives, not through specific policies. And that means focusing on the local level so that people have positive stories of delivery that they can identify that will inform the wider narratives. And I agree that governments of all types have demonstrated how not to do that recently.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Claire, is there a tension between the message that government should be leading with more purpose, but also the public appetite for a more collective form of leadership? And also, what's your one idea on growth that doesn't cost anything?
Yeah, I would like there to be more appetite for collaborative leadership, but I don't really think that's what people want on the whole. I think people want the government to get on with it and deliver for them. I personally believe that bringing the public more into decision making, using more kind of design-led approaches to government would be a good thing, but I don't think there's this big outcry from the public. I think they're just what's wrong with you, or why can't you just deliver what it is you said you were going to deliver, and kind of stick to it and get on with it. So there is a tension, but I just think don't lose focus on the fact that there's a lot wrong with our democracy, but the fact that you have to be putting yourself up in another 5 years' time shows that you have to actually deliver on the things that you said you would, and where you cannot do that or you need to change, the explanation, the communication, the transparency could do with an overhaul. On the question of growth, the one thing I think is that point about private investment. The sort of sting was you can't spend any money on it, but the thing that we have got is we have got huge amounts of private investment. I would like to see us be selling that global Britain message around the world. Political stability is the #1 asset we have, according to investors at this point in time. That is a huge attribute for this Labour government. So I would like to see a celebration of the private investment that I know is coming in, and being able to have outside of the European Union, because it is outside of the European Union, a much clearer message of what our export-led growth strategy will be.
Yeah, thank you. Danny?
Well, just on, I think, Grace's question around, I don't think there's a tension, or if there is one, I don't think we can shy away from confronting it. It comes back to the sort of making politics itself more participatory, making decision-making more deliberative. You know, one of the contradictions of our time, and I saw it so sort of clearly manifested yesterday looking at that presidential inauguration, is that we have a political rhetoric that's sort of inherently anti-elitist. It's about saying, these people have taken power and they control society, that delivers arguably the most elite-funded, elite-controlled government in today's world, right? And so part of my lesson is that we here in the UK need to sort of think about how we preempt that happening here. How do we make sure that, arguably, it's not people like us in rooms like this that are ultimately sort of making decisions, and can we make decisions far more open, transparent, participatory, and deliberative? Do you want a growth answer
Please,
as well? Yeah, so fantastic question, and part of the challenge is about redefining or trying to tell a better story about growth. Let's take the two-child cap on universal credit. It would cost this government, or in these next few years, more to lift the cap. But we did some analysis to look at the long-term growth benefits of reducing poverty today, and those benefits over the long term far outweigh the immediate costs or the savings to government, because poverty has costs. Poverty has costs today, it has costs tomorrow in terms of lower productivity, lower labour force participation. And so for me, it's arguably about sort of trying to tell that story more coherently about success tomorrow starts with making decisions today. And that's where this government seems to be failing at the moment.
Thank you. Anushka, you get the final word.
Just very, very quickly, 2 quick points. One, on growth, I'm not giving an opinion on this, but I think it is interesting that the Lib Dems are pushing for re-entering the customs union, because that's the sort of thing the OBR would score, and it's the sort of thing that Keir Starmer used to very much support, whilst the single market is politically difficult. I think probably they're both quite politically difficult. And just on that idea of... this is a sort of broader thing, but it sort of answers that second question a bit, was these are unprecedented times. We've all just seen Donald Trump come back for a second time. We're seeing the rise of reform. People don't trust politicians. Trust, as you pointed out, is at an all-time low. Part of me thinks they should just take more risks. They are a very, very controlled government, as have every government I've ever covered been, including controlling the media. I think we need our politicians to be human, and maybe the government needs to take more risks in order to show the human side of the cabinet and beyond.
Fantastic. OK, and we're out of time. Huge thanks to the audience for brilliant questions. Many thanks to the panel for a fantastic conversation, especially to Danny for doing a better job than me in highlighting our sponsorship today. Thank you very much. We're now going to have a 5 to 10 minute break while we set up for the next session, which is on rewiring the civil service. So grab yourself a tea or coffee and see you back here shortly. Thank you. Thank you so much.